Texas, December 1944. The morning sun crept slowly over the plains, painting the sky with soft amber light. Inside a wooden mess hall surrounded by barbed wire, the smell of sizzling bacon rolled through the air like an invisible tide. For a moment, even the guards stopped talking. German prisoners shuffled into line, men in worn Wehrmacht jackets, boots scuffed from the march, eyes hollow from war and disbelief. They had expected punishment. They had expected hunger. What they hadn't expected was the sound of laughter coming from an American cook wearing a sweat-stained cowboy hat, humming a country tune as he flipped eggs on an iron griddle. Karl Weiss, a 23-year-old panzer mechanic from Dresden, stood frozen at the serving counter. The cook grinned at him. "Morning, partner," he said, sliding a plate across the counter. On it lay scrambled eggs, 2 thick slices of toast, and bacon. Real bacon, golden and crisp, still sizzling. The smell hit Karl like a memory from another life. He stared, unsure if it was a trick. Behind him the line shuffled forward, boots scraping the wooden floor. "Go on, son," the cook said again, his accent thick with the South. "Ain't no poison in it." Karl took the plate, sat at a long wooden table and looked down at the food. His hands trembled. The bacon glistened with fat. He hadn't tasted pork in almost 2 years. When he bit into it, the crunch and salt filled his mouth, and something inside him broke. He tried to hide it, but the tears came anyway. Across from him, another prisoner muttered, "It's propaganda." But Karl knew it wasn't. It was real. Too real. The taste, the warmth, the kindness. He looked up and saw the cook wink before turning back to his grill. For months, the German soldiers had been told America was a land of brutality, that its soldiers were monsters. But now, sitting in a Texas mess hall, Karl realized the truth was far more dangerous. America didn't just fight with guns. It fought with abundance, with decency, with the power to make a man question everything he'd believed about the world. Outside, the ranch flag flapped lazily in the morning wind. Somewhere beyond the fences, a horse neighed, and the sound mixed with the crackle of bacon grease and the quiet murmur of men eating in silence. In that moment, Karl Weiss understood. The war wasn't over yet, but his faith in the Reich had already begun to collapse. Before capture, Karl Weiss had believed every word of the propaganda posters plastered across Dresden's factories and barracks. They showed grotesque caricatures of Americans, fat, soulless merchants driven by greed, enslaving prisoners and burning Europe for profit. He had heard Nazi officers describe U.S. soldiers as cowards who hid behind machines and rations too weak to fight man to man. On the Eastern Front, he'd seen hunger turn men into ghosts. The Wehrmacht rations were thin, black bread, watery soup, a scrap of sausage once a week if they were lucky. And so, when Karl and his unit were surrounded in France and captured by the Americans, he expected the same or worse. He imagined a punishment fitting for the Reich's enemies: starvation, cruelty, humiliation. But nothing in his training prepared him for Texas. When the ship docked in New York, the prisoners were silent, staring through the rails as the Statue of Liberty glimmered in the distance. They were marched through stations where smiling American nurses handed out blankets and water. The guards spoke to them politely, even saying please. It was disarming. Now, in the wide-open plains of central Texas, Karl felt the contradictions deepen. The camp was fenced, yes, but the guards joked freely. The prisoners worked in the fields under the sun, earning small wages to buy cigarettes, postcards, even harmonicas. At night, the guards played swing music over the loudspeakers, music the Nazis had called degenerate. Yet it lifted the men's spirits in ways the Reich never could. Still, many of the German officers clung to the myth of America the monster. They told the others not to be fooled, that this comfort was a weapon, a trick to break their discipline. "They want to soften you," one sergeant hissed during roll call. "Remember your oath. Remember who you are." But even the most loyal among them couldn't ignore the facts. The food was plentiful. The guards treated them fairly. They received medical care and books to read. One prisoner, a teacher from Munich, whispered to Karl one night, "If this is captivity, what do you call what we left behind?" That question lingered long after lights out. The next morning, Karl awoke to the familiar smell of bacon again. He lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, thinking of the difference between the America and Goebbels speeches and the one serving him breakfast. One was a monster. The other, a mirror reflecting a truth too powerful for propaganda to erase. And as the camp bell rang for work detail, Karl began to suspect that this quiet, orderly land, where even prisoners were treated with dignity, might be the most dangerous enemy the Reich had ever faced. It began in the gray ruins of Normandy, where Karl Weiss and hundreds of other German soldiers were rounded up by American infantry after the collapse of the front. Their uniforms were filthy, their weapons discarded, their pride shattered. The Americans gave them rations, real food, canned meat, bread, and even coffee, and then herded them aboard trucks bound for the coast. Karl remembered staring out the truck's window at villages reduced to ash. The people, French, Belgian, Dutch, didn't look at the prisoners with fear or hatred. They looked with exhaustion, as if the war itself had consumed their souls. For the first time, Karl felt the weight of what Germany had done. They were loaded onto Liberty ships, massive steel vessels built faster than Germany could sink them. Inside the ship's hold, the air was damp and salty. The POWs were guarded by American sailors who treated them not as animals but as soldiers who had simply lost. Karl overheard one sailor joke, "Don't worry, boys, you're heading somewhere warm." When the ship reached New York Harbor, the men pressed against the rails. What they saw defied everything they had been told. A skyline of steel and glass untouched by war. No ruins, no craters, no hunger. The harbor bustled with ships, cranes, and workers. America was not starving, it was thriving. From there they were placed on trains that crossed a nation larger than Karl had ever imagined. For days they rolled through endless landscapes, forests, plains, mountains, towns where children waved from porches and people smiled at the sight of the POW cars. The contrast was unbearable. In Germany, children hid in bunkers. Here they played baseball. At each stop, Karl noted the abundance: overflowing markets, long trains of grain and meat, rail cars full of machinery. He whispered to another prisoner, "They build faster than we can destroy." The other man only nodded, too stunned to speak. When the train finally entered Texas, the prisoners were struck by the vastness of it. The horizon seemed to stretch forever, dotted with cattle and windmills. Heat shimmered off the rails. The guards joked about the best steaks in the world, and ranch breakfasts that could feed an army. Karl thought it was just American boasting, until he saw the mess hall himself. The camp was simple but clean. Whitewashed barracks, open yards, and fields for labor. It didn't feel like a prison. The men were handed fresh uniforms, medical checkups, and clean bunks. Each received a bar of soap and a towel. Even the guards smiled as they passed out plates piled high with food. As Karl sat on his bunk that night, the sound of swing music drifted through the camp's loudspeakers. The rhythm was strange and alive. He realized he had not heard music since Dresden. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace, and an unsettling thought crept into his mind. Perhaps the Americans didn't need to break Germany. Perhaps they only needed to show them how small the Reich had really been. The truth of America's power didn't come in speeches or threats. It came in numbers, quiet, relentless, impossible to deny. Karl Weiss began to understand it the way a mechanic understands machinery, by counting the parts and realizing how everything fits. The camp clerk, an older sergeant named Miller, liked to talk while handing out work assignments. One morning, he leaned against the doorframe of the barracks and said casually, "You boys know there are about 425,000 German prisoners here in the States, 50,000 of them right here in Texas." His words hung in the air. Karl blinked. That was the size of an entire German army group. Later, Carl learned that the U.S. had built more than 70 branch camps across Texas alone, each self-sufficient, each supplied daily with food, fuel, and medicine. It was industrial organization applied to humanity itself. The prisoners were issued 3 full meals a day, sometimes totaling over 3,000 calories, nearly double what a German soldier at the front received by 1944. The Geneva Convention required decent treatment. America went beyond it. Each POW received about $1.50 worth of food per day. Cheaper than feeding a U.S. soldier, but with better balance. Bread, meat, milk, eggs, vegetables. Even coffee was served, strong and black. For the Americans, feeding enemies wasn't just compassion. It was strategy. Healthy men worked better. Healthy men talked. Healthy men went home with new ideas. Carl noticed the precision everywhere. Trucks rolled into camp every morning, unloading supplies on schedule, every box labeled and inventoried. The cookhouse logs were kept like bank records. Pounds of flour, gallons of milk, ounces of bacon grease. Nothing wasted, nothing missing. It was logistics as art. By contrast, Carl remembered the chaos of German supply lines. The scrounging, the hunger, the broken trains, the warehouses bombed before they could unload. The Reich had tried to conquer the world with willpower. America was doing it with spreadsheets. Even the smallest things spoke volumes. The camp had a library, hundreds of books in both English and German. There were classes for mechanics, carpentry, and English. The Americans encouraged learning, not just labor. "You can't hate a man who teaches you how to build," one prisoner whispered during class. At night, when the guards switched on the floodlights, Carl looked across the camp and saw dozens of other prisoners reading, studying, or writing letters by lamplight. It was a different kind of army. An army of thought. The next week, Carl overheard an American officer explaining the war production figures to a visitor. "We built 96,000 planes last year, 49,000 tanks, and more trucks than the rest of the world combined," the man said. "Our factories are the front line." Carl turned the numbers over in his mind, feeling them like bullets in his hand. The war had never been fair. Germany had tried to fight an idea with ideology, and the math of that war was already lost. The first time Carl Weiss saw a Texas ranch, he thought it was another world. The camp's work detail had been assigned to help local ranchers during harvest and cattle season. The prisoners were loaded onto trucks at sunrise, escorted by 2 guards who carried rifles but rarely needed them. The air smelled of hay, leather, and morning dew, a scent Carl would never forget. The ranch stretched farther than the eye could see. Fences ran like threads across the land, and cattle dotted the horizon like moving shadows. The owner, a broad-shouldered man in a straw hat named Jack Dempsey, no relation to the boxer, he joked, greeted the prisoners with a grin. "Boys, I don't care what uniform you wore. You work hard, you eat well. That's the deal." For men who had spent months behind barbed wire, the open land felt like freedom itself. The prisoners fixed fences, dug irrigation ditches, and helped round up cattle. Their hands blistered at first, soft from confinement. But soon the work became its own reward. Out here, the lines between guard and captive blurred. During lunch breaks, Jack's wife brought out sandwiches, coffee, and sometimes cold Coca-Cola bottles, the glass sweating in the heat. Carl had never tasted it before. The first sip was electric, sweet, sharp, alive. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "You like it?" Jack chuckled. "We call it the taste of America." The men worked hard because they were treated like men. They were paid 80 cents a day, part of it in camp scrip they could spend on cigarettes, paper, or candy. In the evenings, they rode back to camp tired but strangely fulfilled. Not beaten or humiliated, just human again. One afternoon, a young cowboy named Tom approached Carl while they were mending a fence. "You ever ride one of these?" he asked, pointing to a chestnut mare. Carl shook his head, laughing nervously. "Not unless you count tanks." Tom grinned. "Well, tanks don't buck." And before Carl could protest, the cowboy handed him the reins. The horse shifted beneath him, muscles rippling like coiled steel. Tom kept a steady hand on the bridle, walking beside him. Easy now, she's got more heart than hate. That simple act, a cowboy teaching a German prisoner to ride, became a story whispered through the camp for weeks. It was absurd, beautiful, and deeply confusing. The enemy wasn't supposed to show kindness, yet here they were, working side by side, breaking bread and sharing jokes. At night, the prisoners sat outside their barracks watching the stars. They talked about home, about wives, about cities turned to rubble, about what they would tell their children someday. And always, Carl thought about the rancher's words. You work hard, you eat well. It wasn't just food he was being fed. It was dignity. By the time winter came, Carl no longer felt like a prisoner. He felt like a man learning, one meal and one sunrise at a time, what freedom really meant. It was late January 1945 when the smell of bacon returned. The war in Europe was nearing its end, though few inside the Texas camps knew how close it was. That morning, frost clung to the barbed wire, and the cattle lowed somewhere beyond the fences. The camp loudspeaker crackled to life, calling the men for breakfast. Carl Weiss trudged across the yard with his mess tin in hand, expecting the usual fare, scrambled eggs, oatmeal, or biscuits. But as soon as he stepped inside the mess hall, the air hit him. The smell was unmistakable, rich, smoky, alive. Bacon. The cooks, mostly Texans who took pride in their craft, had managed to get a delivery from a nearby meat plant. That day's menu was simple: fried eggs, bread, and bacon for every man, POW or guard alike. When Carl reached the counter, he found the same cowboy cook as months before, sleeves rolled up, grease popping around him. "Morning, Fritz," the man said with a half grin. "Guess it's about time you boys had yourselves a proper breakfast again." Carl nodded silently. The cook scooped a few sizzling strips onto his plate. They gleamed like gold in the light. Around him, men murmured in disbelief. Some even laughed softly, not mockery, but relief. They sat down in silence, rows of once proud soldiers, now just men with plates before them. And when Carl bit into that first piece, the taste hit him like memory and revelation. It was the same as before, crisp, salty, perfect. But it no longer felt like mockery. This time it felt like forgiveness. One prisoner whispered, "Do you think they're mocking us?" Another replied, "No. I think they just don't hate us." As the meal went on, something changed in the air. The guards and the prisoners began to talk. Small things at first, about weather, work, baseball. A few even laughed together. Carl caught sight of one guard showing photos of his family to a German sergeant. The sergeant nodded, smiling faintly, then took out a worn photo of his own wife. Two enemies, bound by the same ache. When breakfast ended, the prisoners lingered, not wanting to leave the warmth or the smell. Carl looked around and saw faces softened by something unfamiliar. Peace. Later that day, while working on the ranch, Carl told the cowboy who taught him to ride, "Back home we were told you were beasts." The cowboy shrugged. "You heard wrong, friend. We just work hard and like our bacon." It was such a simple answer, almost absurd, but it shattered years of indoctrination more effectively than any lecture could. That night, Carl wrote in his diary, "This morning I ate bacon and saw America. They do not conquer with fear. They conquer with breakfast." It was half a joke, half a confession. But in the quiet light of that Texas morning, surrounded by kindness he couldn't understand, Carl Weiss had already begun to surrender in the only way that mattered: inside. By the spring of 1945, the Texas air had grown warm again. Wildflowers spread across the fields outside the camp, and the prisoners' routines carried on as usual. Work, meals, reading, and letters home that rarely arrived. But something in the air had changed. Conversations were quieter now, more cautious. Rumors traveled faster than mail.